Oi, oi, it's your boy, Jack Slack. It's the Jack Slack podcast, and today we're going to be doing the Slacky Awards, which I hope will provide some much needed levity because currently MMA's gone ape shit. New Year's Eve, Dana White slapped his wife on film, in public, and naturally, every conservative grifter on Twitter is out there doing the equal rights, equal fights thing. The replies, I mean, it turns out that a lot of UFC fans are just like, I wish a motherfucking woman would try and swing on me. Or, it's just bizarre. But it was, quite interesting because dudes were putting out their paid interference pieces, and moments later it turned out that Phil Baroni murdered his wife, or may have murdered his wife, or girlfriend, or whatever it is. But he's under arrest for murdering a woman. So that's where MMA is at the moment. I'm going to step back from that. I don't want to do that shit at all. If I have any thoughts on it, it's that, like, regardless of who you are or what the personal dynamics of your relationship are, if you get to the point that you're slapping each other in public, you probably shouldn't be married anymore. And I would recommend that you look up Kevin Ioli's amazing take on this. It's one of the most insane articles I've ever read. Kevin Ioli, obviously a courtier for the UFC. And a lot of these guys have been showing their card this week by writing as little as possible. Brett Okamoto did as little as possible. This is, it's always sad because I personally like Brett Okamoto. It's just that he is a massive UFC shill. But Kevin Ioli went all out sucking the dick for this one. The second paragraph is just telling you about all of Dana White's charitable contributions in the world. You're like, who else gets this treatment? And the last paragraph, or the second last paragraph, he's talking about he's saying nothing White says or no amount of money he throws at the issue will end it completely. This is an insidious problem in our culture. Sadly, it isn't going away. Does he mean the insidious problem of domestic abuse, or does he mean the insidious problem of domestic abuse having a stigma? Because if you read the article, it's quite easy to get confused there. But the one opinion that I will give you of my own is that if you can't do your job without the UFC giving you a press pass and access to Dana White, you didn't have any talent to begin with. There have been plenty of journalists who've been banned from going to UFC events, and it sucks to lose your ringside seat for things, but they've managed to get on with it. People like Loretta Hunt, and she's doing bigger and better things in other areas of the media now too. But if you can't book the interviews on your own, if you can't get people to care about you interviewing someone unless you're the first one there ringside, you didn't have any talent. You don't have any opinions. You don't have any insights, And I don't think that's true for most people. I think most of these people are just terrified of having to use their own ability to generate interest and views and things. Kevin Ioli's been around boxing forever. I'm sure he has thousands of interesting stories, but he's attached to the teat of Dana White, personally, and the UFC. And as an 80-year-old man, he's terrified to let go of it. But I'd rather talk about happier things because the Baroni one is really just horrible. So we're going to do my year-end awards. I put out a couple of threads on Twitter, YouTube. I didn't do Facebook, but asking people for their nominations, remind me of all the things that I've forgotten. So here we go. Once again, the categories are Game Plan of the Year, Technical Turnaround, brackets Most Improved Fighter, Breakout Technique, and But Why, the award for piss poor fight IQ. I also had Event of the Year at one point, but I just stopped doing it because it was boring. A couple of people suggested one anyway. But yeah, we'll start with Game Plan of the Year. To give you the history, 2014, John Jones versus Glover Teixeira. 2015, RDA versus Pettis. 2016, Garbrandt versus Cruz. 2017, Namajunas versus Ioana Jędrzejczyk 1. 2018, Edwards versus Cerrone. 2019, I didn't bother. 2020, Holloway versus Volkanovski 2. 2021, Ngannou versus Miocic. Now, there's been a load of interesting suggestions for this one. So I'll kick off with Keita versus Giga Chikadze. Calvin Keita versus Giga Chikadze. Giga was on the way up. He just stopped Cub Swanson and Edson Barboza, two old men, and picked up the first stoppages of his UFC career, which they've been dying for him to do for ages. They kept finding worse and worse opponents for him, and then they finally gave him the step up and he started finishing dudes. And Keita was on the way down. So the expectation was that Giga was going to give Keita horrible trouble. Keita came out and did not what he normally does. He wasn't just jabbing. He wasn't not doing enough, which is a large part of what Calvin Kattar does. He knew that he had to get in this guy's face, and he did it. And he did it in a really entertaining way, a really smart way that kept him from getting hurt a lot. And it was a really nice use of the switch hitting generally, but also of the switch 45. So Giga Chikadze's southpaw, Kattar's orthodox. When Kattar was walking towards him, he'd take a step out to his left side and then stab in with his right foot into a southpaw stance. So he was moving forwards, but presenting his back rather than his liver to be kicked. As we're always talking about kicking into open side, kicking into closed side. If you're kicking towards, you want to be kicking into the side that their belly button is facing out towards, not into their back. When they're standing, side on, half facing, not square, but the natural open side, closed side thing. And by using the switch 45 throughout, Kattar was able to change into a closed stance just long enough to jab Giga Chikadze on the snoot and then follow up from orthodox or from southpaw. He was doing fantastic work in that one. Hit him with a load of great elbows. Just ran him ragged, because that's the problem with being a kicker. You have to keep re-establishing space to kick comfortably, because kicking badly is an invitation to get bundled over or just beat up. Doesn't matter if the guy doesn't want to take you down; he'll push you back off that missed kick and he'll hit you 3 or 4 times. So it was a really lovely performance from Kattar. I think, very strong entry there. Volk versus Holloway 3 is one that's getting mentioned a lot. 2020, I gave Holloway versus Volk 2 the title, because I thought Holloway's adjustments in that fight were fantastic when he had so much trouble in the first fight. Adjustments in this fight, counter to those 2020 adjustments, really excellent stuff. So to catch you up, first fight, Holloway wants to jab in because he's the best boxer in the UFC, baby. And every time he goes to jab in, he has to extend his stance. And he stands more bladed, he goes more side on, and his lead leg is right there in the middle. So Volkanovski was doing this thing where he'd step back and he'd kick, basically with leg power. It wasn't a full committed bodyweight movement, but he'd slide back and kick the lead leg. And because Holloway was putting himself in such a compromised position, it would buckle the knee in. It would really give Holloway trouble. And you saw in that first fight, Holloway can't really get going. Second fight, Holloway starts using a floating step or a fake teep. He keeps picking up his lead leg and gliding in behind it. He stands a lot shorter. He comes in behind like step up left high kicks and then throws punches afterwards. Or he'd stand back and he'd make Volkanovski come to him, knowing that Volkanovski in that first fight kept using like shifting right hooks and things, stuff that he had to cover a lot of distance. So Holloway's hitting him with counter uppercuts. When Holloway's leading, he's coming in behind a raised lead leg, which you'll notice is something that Volkanovski himself has always done against people when they're trying to low kick him. They work out that what he's doing. Once you've felt it a few times, guys want to do it back. So Ortega, who doesn't really low kick much at all, was trying to slide back and low kick as Volkanovski was coming in, and Volkanovski was using the fake teep or the floating step, or whatever you want to call it, just to come in. It just picks your leg up while you hop in on one leg effectively, but you're hopping and falling down on the lead leg. So what you're doing is you're just taking the leg over the path of the kick and placing it down closer to the opponent. And you mix in real teeps from time to time, which both Holloway and Volkanovski do, or did. So that was what gave Volkanovski trouble in the second fight. And in the third fight, I do think there is some truth to Max slowing down. Certainly from that Yair Rodriguez fight, that's what I took away. But the tactical adjustments were made based on stuff that Holloway had found out worked in the second fight. So this time, Volkanovski's sliding back and letting Max come in with the floating step, but he's sliding all the way back, and then he's coming in with he's dropping counter punches, overhands across the top and things. He's not just trying to kick the leg, or he's taking a big slide back and then he's kicking the leg. He was working on the assumption that Holloway was going to do something to chew up distance and float over the path of the counter low kick. And then part of the problem was that because Holloway was never actually throwing the teep, the float step was always a float step. So Volkanovski would slide back and then counter with the overhand as Holloway fell down onto his lead leg. There's a big transfer of weight going into the other guy's overhand. So Holloway teeped occasionally, but Volkanovski tried to hit the Osotogari off that. The later rounds, Holloway sort of abandoned the float step and went back to trying to punch his way in, and then that was just back to fight one. It was crazy, that was slide back and low kick as Max enters. And then Volkanovski was able to use his wrestling fairly effectively too. Not super effectively, because Holloway is extremely hard to take down, but effectively enough to take breaks and well, not take breaks, but take breaks in the striking and kill some time. Really, like, it was one of those fights where I think it was a sort of passing of one man's prime and the other one really entering just at a super elite level, because Volkanovski's distancing and timing all looked superb when he actually boxed with Max, and he'd jab or he'd pull, and he had his distance perfectly despite being the shorter fighter. I know that their reaches are, Max actually has a pretty short arm reach for his height, but height is still an issue too. It plays into range. But yeah, I thought while Volkanovski looked much sharper, when we're talking about like athleticism and athletic peak, I still think that the changes he made, that Holloway came in with a lot of the same stuff that he'd done well with in fight 2, and Volkanovski immediately said, "No, that's not working this time." And then Holloway went back to stuff from fight 1, which is more like his standard fighting style. And Volkanovski went back to the tactics from fight 1. So, really, I'm always saying with these game plan of the years, I don't really want to give someone a game plan of the year if they did their normal thing and it just worked perfectly because the other guy was so such a ill-suited matchup for it. I really like to give guys the game plan of the year for adjusting what they do or doing something completely different, like Keita versus Chikadze, or mid-fight adjustments. It's being made to do something. It's either choosing or being made to do something that isn't your game, your A game. And I think that both Holloway in 2020 and Volkanovski here are really good examples. Someone said a few people said Oliveira versus Gaethje. This is exactly the sort of thing I'm talking about, where I'm saying that their styles sort of played into each other more than any one game plan. I did like that Charles was dealing with the low kicks very well. He knew it was going to be an issue, so he was checking them. That is a fight-specific adjustment. He's not training a ton of check-in low kicks to deal with someone like Islam Makhachev. He's training tons of dealing with low kicks to deal with Justin Gaethje, because he's going to low kick your legs off. But a lot of what he did that was really effective, pounding the body, threatening chokes off as the opponent grabs your leg, lighting them up with straight punches and counter left hooks, all fairly standard Charles Oliveira stuff. But then that's what game planning is. It's taking what you've got and adjusting the sliders. That's all still game planning. But it's not a super extreme example of someone changing what they do to beat someone. It was more the things that he did were really horrible for Justin Gaethje, because Gaethje he wants to drive a high pace. He's very hittable, and he wilts if you hit him in the body. One of the things, when guys are dealing with super aggressive opponents, they get fixated on knocking them out because they're like, oh, I've got to relieve this pressure somehow. And really, a lot of the time, you'd be better off just changing levels and just throwing a good straight punch to their solar plexus. That was the only thing that Jack Dempsey admitted Gene Tunney hurt him with. He said, I think it was their first fight or their second fight, he came out and he was like, I'm getting to business. I think it was the second fight, because he came out and he's like, I'm getting to business immediately. I'm not having you run from me. And Gene Tunney stopped and dropped a right straight on his solar plexus. And he said he never felt better. never really got back into fighting shape in the fight. And Ngannou versus Gane is another really interesting one, because I think, it's crazy because we're on the cusp of giving Ngannou 2 game plans of the year in a row. Because I thought he looked phenomenal against Miocic. Just, again, that was more of a leveling out the sliders, playing different things against different opponents, using the low kicks, squaring up and throwing power jabs instead of swinging overhands and things like that. Some good body shots even in that fight. And, of course, all the brilliant counter wrestling that he was employing. But this one is far more of a decision of how to fight, changing how you fight to match the opponent. Because Garner was always going to be tricky on the outside, and Garner, they trained a bit together before, but Garner, if you've done a few rounds with Garner, he's probably seen a lot of what you have, and that's one of the really interesting things about fighting generally, and one of the reasons that I'm a big advocate of point sparring, even for guys who aren't point fighters, don't come from point fighting backgrounds. It's something. I don't want to sound like John Kavanagh saying upgrading the software while not damaging the hardware, but if you're play sparring with someone in boxing gloves and you're going 50%, 70%, whatever, when you get into a fight, things are always going to be faster and harder because guys are going faster and harder. If you're dealing with footwork, you can't just footwork harder. Like trying to corner people and trying to evade people. That is something that stays fairly close to the same when you're doing a really intense fight or sparring session, and when you're just doing the footwork and playing tag. So one of the reasons that fighters like Garn are so tricky is because they can day after day, and Wonderboy's another great example, people who have really got the footwork down and the distancing, is that they can day to day just do that over and over and over again. It's kind of like why Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu did so well early on in MMA and things like that. And Judo did quite well in early MMA and wrestling because they're full resistance sports. If in boxing and kickboxing, you really have to be quite careful with how many hard rounds you do. Footwork-based fighters who are working on their footwork and just playing tag with people every day, I'm not saying replace your fucking sparring, but they get the hundreds and they can have the hundreds and hundreds of rounds. I've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rounds of BJJ sparring at decent intensity, but not nearly as many rounds of people trying to take my head off with punches. So that is to say that any amount of, Ngannou that Garn had seen, probably advantageous to him because he's a distance fighter. He's a guy who's going to stand on the outside and try and make you look silly. And Ngannou apparently was struggling with knee injuries. So first thing he did, both knee straps on. Do not turn up with one knee support on because you are putting a giant target on it. But he came out and he wrestled really effectively against a guy who, we can laugh at him for not being a great wrestler, but he's a decent wrestler. Garn has been using his wrestling far more than Ngannou did on his way up. Far more than most fighters are doing, to be honest. Curtis Blades is the good takedown artist of the heavyweight division. You've got a couple of specialists like, I was going to say Olenek, but I think he's gone now. Spivak, Romanov maybe. And then you've got the more generalists who actually use their wrestling and grappling really well, like Tom Aspinall and Garn. And that's where I put him. And Ngannou really didn't use offensive wrestling on the way up, and when he met Stipe, he was very much tired out by the wrestling, and he basically did this. He gave Garn the same lesson by wrestling with him. Now, maybe it was the case that was all he could do, but I think there's 95% of people, if they had Ngannou's skills or skill set, and they came into that fight, they'd be like, well, I'm just going to have to knock him out earlier, because you'd go to the thing that you're comfortable with, and he did the thing that he wasn't comfortable with to try and shut down movement in the fight, to try and avoid that prolonged fighting on the outside, and to put some of his strength and power on Garn, rather than just like hope for an early finish. I've seen guys come into world title fights and be like, I just have to get it finished early because I'm injured. I mean, we're going to get into the but whys later, but people have been nominating TJ Dillashaw all year for coming into a fight and being like, well, I just have to get it finished before my shoulder pops out. Islam versus Charles has been suggested by a few people. I think that's, in terms of performance, impressive performance of the year. I don't know if a lot of what Islam did was Charles specific. It is, me only having these 4 award categories does sort of limit me talking about really great fights or really great showings that weren't necessarily elite game planning. Whittaker versus Vettori. Yeah, I mean, Whittaker's been doing the same sort of stuff to all the top contenders recently, but he looked phenomenal in that one. Someone said Henry versus Barcelos. I'd actually say this especially because Victor Henry's last one didn't look too great. But Barcelos is tricky. He's a great counterpuncher, very, very dangerous. And Henry managed to put him on the back foot with feints and punish him with front kicks to the body. That was the one that really upset him. And as the fight went on, he was able to apply incredible volume and tire Barcelos out. Especially as in the first round, Barcelos had clipped Henry and really shown why he was such a dangerous counterpuncher. And that's a lot of big fights. That'll be where the guy shells up, and he knows that he needs to be feinting and convincing the other guy to swing at air so that he stops countering so effectively. But once you've been hit with a good one, very tempting to just go into yourself and not throw as much and not feint as much, not commit to real strikes as much. That's where guys lose it, because if you're just feinting and you're not committing to real strikes for fear of getting countered, the other guy's not going to take his finger off the trigger. He's just going to identify your fakes more easily. Someone said Whittaker versus Izzy 2. Was that last year? I feel like that was last year, and I wouldn't even know which one you meant because that was a pretty evenly fought fight. Nunes, someone nominated Nunes for every category, just for switching to southpaw instead of learning to defend a jab. Now, on one hand, it is very, very funny the lady goat cannot deal with a dipping jab to the point that she had to switch stances and learn a whole new way of striking to avoid it. On the other hand, I'm always in favor of people switching to southpaw and showing a different look. And that's what she did. I think Pena came in with the confidence that she'd already beaten her before, and she'd just do more of the same thing just as hard, gut her way through. And the dipping jab was completely off the table because of the switch to southpaw. Not only are the angles not right, but because of how the open sides are set up, you can just keep threatening to throw up the high kick and knock them out if they start dipping to the inside. And her footwork looked good in that fight. She was drawing her forward, countering. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't bad. It was just kind of embarrassing how she lost the belt in the first place. Aljamain Sterling versus Petr Yan 2 was suggested quite a few times. Yeah, I think Sterling was... Well, I've said this before. I said this before the second fight, actually. I said that I felt Sterling was onto something the first time round, keeping Yan under pressure and on the back foot. Problem was that he did it so much that he got tired. And the third, and particularly the fourth round, I think it was the fourth round, he was just useless out there. And this first and second round, he was landing okay, but he was doing a lot to land not a lot. This time around, he was much more restrained on the feet. I think he threw something like 260 strikes in the first fight and missed half of them. I mean, he was landing at a good clip, but it was a lot of activity. And of course, that fight didn't even go the full distance. Whereas I've got Fight Metric up here now, or whatever it's called now. But in the rematch, he threw 110 strikes. So, obviously a much slower rate or lower rate. And he attempted 22 takedowns to score 2. Obviously, the fight ended up with him in dominant positions in, I think, 3 or 4 rounds. So not telling the whole story there. But I felt like he had the skills to give Petr Yan trouble. And I said that before their second fight, when everyone was saying like, "Oh, absolute bum, going to get rinsed." Well, he won 2 rounds out of 4 in the first time around, and he's pretty good. But I think this was another one of just leveling out the sliders and realizing that like diving desperately for takedowns in the first fight was a bad look. But I think he made the right decisions, because my idea would have been focus more on the striking in the second fight, limit the number of exchanges, try and win them kicking and so on. And then punctuate with some takedown attempts. But he did the smart thing of getting back to his bread and butter. He was like, okay, I'm striking less and I'm wrestling more. Really, it was just, a wonderful fight, because people were so shitty about that first fight. And they managed to completely delude themselves into thinking that like it wasn't at any point competitive. I remember watching it in the lead up to the second one going, what are people talking about? This wasn't 4 rounds of domination with an unfortunate stoppage. It was 2 rounds of Aljo, 2 rounds of Yan, and then a very obvious foul for the DQ. But we'll get into all that shit in the But Why award, because there's been a few this year. So yeah, probably not giving it to that fight, but it was a good game plan. Someone said might be a bit weird for game plan of the year, but I think Burns deserves a shout out for how he handled the power and takedown of Chimaev. Yeah, I mean, he went at him, he just tried to counter left hook him, and he did a couple of times, knocked him to his knees. The cage wrestling was interesting. You saw a couple of cool Granbys and things like that, and Chimaev backing off. Chimaev himself said that like he just didn't want to engage in the guard after Burns threw up an armbar. But I think it does highlight an important difference between, you cannot play guard set against the fence. And I think people think that they do. It's a completely different skill set. It's a completely different game. If you have a moderately dangerous guard, it's worth just turning off the fence if you're dealing with someone who really knows what they're doing offensively along the fence. Dariush versus Gamrot, yep. I mean, Dariush versus Gamrot / Sarukian versus Gamrot, stopping takedowns and throwing lovely body kicks and things. And good left hands from Dariush in that fight too. Yeah, it was decent. I'm not going to give it to that though. Hermansson versus Curtis, fuck off. That's just Curtis fighting like a bum. That's not... Jack Hermansson jiggling and running around in one direction. I am not giving that game plan of the year, even if it was perfect for that fight. Someone said Cheeto drawing Cruz into the left high kick with the left cross feint. That's a move. That's not a game plan. His game plan was to throw one good strike every round and hope it hurt him and succeed. Cheeto is not winning game plan of the year for any of the fights that he's had recently. Not even in contention, mate. And then someone said Sandhagen versus Song Yadong for the takedown threat and elbows. I really did like that, to be honest. So on paper, Song Yadong been wrestling with Team Alpha Male for ages. He knows how to stop a shot. Corey Sandhagen does not have the level change of Chad Mendez or Uriah Faber or whoever. But it's one of those things. If you don't, as long as the other guy has to do something to deal with the technique, you can use that. Because if he's sprawling, you can try and hit him with flying knees and uppercuts and things. You can just tap his leg and make him leap through the air back. If you watched Song Yadong sprawl, he was like jumping into parallel with the floor 2 feet above it and then spanking down in a belly flop every time. Super athletic, but that's going to take a lot of energy. And then, of course, if you don't do that, if you don't do the thing, this is the thing, like people get caught up in resumes and levels of striking and shit, but if you don't deal with the threat, you get hit by it. Floyd Mayweather, if he stops slipping punches, gets hit by the punches. If you don't try to defend the takedown, if you just go, well, I've tried too many times and he's faking quite a lot, and you stop trying to defend it, Corey Sandhagen was able to get him off his feet, and he did it with John Lineker too, who's also got a pretty decent sprawl. D1 Corey Sandhagen, he is not, but by using it lots to set up, or just to show it and then try for flying knees and shit, and then actually just committing to it, he did a great job. Oh, and then Moreno versus Kai Kara France is another one that people really like. I loved that fight. It does really fit the bill for our requirements in that Brandon Moreno was fighting in a different stance to usual. He had to shorten his stance up. It's standing like a sprinter sort of stance. If you watch Felix Trinidad back in the day, back foot, heel off the floor, like he's about to jump out of the blocks. It was interesting because Brandon Moreno doesn't normally fight out that stance. And if you watch when he got into slipping punches and trying to counter, he spread his legs out again. His legs were a lot straighter and they were out wide. But as a base, he was standing in that very short stance with both knees well bent so that he could pull his lead leg back or pick it up and check kicks. And so that he could always throw the left high kick was another thing that Dean Thomas was saying throughout. But he was having very little trouble with the calf kicks in that fight. He was landing his own kicks really well and applying pressure. And the other thing that I really loved in that performance was watching it at the time. I remember thinking he's having a bit of trouble in the third. Oh, and he hits this amazing comeback body kick. You watch that fight. Every exchange they have, he chases Kai Kara France out of it with a run-up left kick. And a lot of the times it's to the head to keep Kara France's right hand at home, or also just to punish him if he's slipping or dipping out of position. But a lot of times it's to the body. That kick that knocked him out or finished the fight, that was just one of about 20 body kicks he put in throughout that fight. Always the same. It was always coming out of an exchange, chase him back with the left body kick. And he did a real good job. He kept Kara France from landing big blows. I would have considered actually Kara France versus Askar Askarov for this award as well. He did a great job against Askarov. He was largely wrestling with jabs as his jabs and low calf kicks as his main volume weapons, and then landing the odd really good punch. He's another one who I always talk about Prince Nazim throwing himself into his punches. If you're a small man, you don't have a lot of muscle compared to the heavyweights to throw around. You don't have as much weight to just the weight of your arm hitting and it's gonna hurt. You have to find ways to throw your whole body into things. And Kara France is very good at that. He lands one or two big punches around, and they're always big booming shots. If you watch the Kara France Moreno fight, there's a great one where he comes off the rope, of the fence rather. He jabs and he steps into this enormous uppercut, and it hits Moreno in the chest as he's ducking, which sucks, but is not the same as if it hit him in the face. That would have been bad. But Kara France is really good at making single big connections happen. And largely, it's a good style for him because so much of his time is spent dealing with the threat of grappling from all these scrambly grapplers he fights. But yeah, he was kept on the defensive for most of that fight. Brandon Moreno was also fighting well on the counter. It was really interesting because you could see he was trying to apply pressure, which he does a lot normally, but he was trying to do it from this shortened stance, and he was having to remind himself constantly to shorten the stance up to be in position to check or pull from kicks. But yeah, I think that's... who do I give it to? Ngannou versus Garner is tempting. Volk versus Holloway is tempting. Keita versus Giga is tempting. And Moreno versus Kai Kara France is also tempting. I'm going to say Calvin Keita because I think he fought the most against type in that fight. Calvin Kattar going forward and trying to tear someone's head off is not what I associate with Calvin Kattar. So Kattar versus Giga Chikadze wins my game plan of the year. Obviously, just mine. You don't have to agree. You don't have to get mad. But when I'm looking at a guy making stylistic change-ups in his own game to better exploit stuff in the opponent's game, that's what really does it for me. And that's part of the reason that I love this sport so much. Watching people, because this is a sport where everyone is convinced that you are who you are, and that's it. You know, think of how Charles Oliveira, he turned himself around, ran for the title. And the book has been written on so many guys so many times, and they make changes in either their own style or in their game plan for the opponent, and it completely changes the whole thing. Nowhere more than this sport is strategy in a single bout, or a single match rather, more important and more productive, I'd say. You bring something out, you bring out something new and clever for a football match. You're going to have to play the same people in the same season probably, or even the next season. You bring something clever out for one fight in a fighting career, that's like, one fight can be like 5% of your fights in a successful fighting career. So the stakes are higher and the decisions mean more. Anyway, that's that category done. Before we move on, it's probably best to note that a couple of these I actually did post-fight articles for this year on the Patreon. Volkanovski versus Holloway, I did. Oh, people were asking for Wonderboy versus Holland, but that was just Wonderboy doing his usual shit, but I wrote about that one too. Kattar versus Chikadze, I think I wrote about that one. There's a few. If you're a Patreon boy, go check it out.